72 years ago today exactly, the Korean War Armistice was signed, marking the ceasing of hostilities in the Korean War, though it didn't formally end the war because no peace treaty was actually ever signed. The Korean War began on June 25th of 1950 when North Korean forces, supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea, aiming to unify the peninsula under communist rule. Now, when this happened, the United States and other United Nations member states intervened to support South Korea, while China later ended up joining North Korea. By mid-1951, the war had reached a stalemate along the 38th parallel, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. Intense fighting continued, but the front line stabilized, leading to calls for negotiations to end the conflict. By 1953, the war had caused millions of deaths, including civilians, and widespread destruction on both sides. Both sides ended up facing mounting pressure to end the fighting, particularly as the conflict risked escalating into a broader global war. Now, armistice negotiations began on July 10th of 1951 at Kaesong, which at the time was under North Korean control, and later moved to Panmunjom, which is a neutral village along the 38th parallel. The talks involved representatives from the UN command, primarily the US, and North Korea and China. Now, the one major sticking point to this whole thing was the repatriation of the prisoners of war, and the United Nations insisted on voluntary repatriation, which would allow prisoners to choose whether to return to their home countries. Now, the repatriation issue prolonged negotiations. Now, the agreement on the ceasefire line, which became known as the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ, was contentious, but eventually set near the 38th parallel. Negotiations also covered the establishment of a neutral supervisory body and mechanisms to enforce the ceasefire. Unfortunately, throughout this whole time, talks were frequently stalled by mistrust, propaganda, and the continued military operations happening in the countries. Both sides engaged in limited offensive to gain leverage, such as the Battle of Pork Chop Hill and Old Baldy in 1953. Eventually, the death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in March of 1953 shifted Soviet policy, with his successors urging North Korea and China to seek peace with the United States and South Korea. At the time, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who took office in January of 1953, pushed for an end to the war, threatening to use nuclear weapons if negotiations failed. Now, at the time, China, which was facing economic strain and domestic challenges, also sought to conclude the conflict. Eventually, the armistice was officially signed on July 27th of 1953 at 10 a.m. or in Panmunjom. Now, at the time, South Korea's President Syngman Rhee refused to sign the armistice as he opposed to a ceasefire that left Korea divided. However, the UN command signed on behalf of the Allied forces, including South Korea. After this all was done, a ceasefire was established which halted all hostilities. And the fighting officially stopped at 10 p.m. on July 27th, 1953, exactly 12 hours after the signing.